everyone. Welcome to our 7th in a series of ICSVE Zoom panel discussions discussing various issues of terrorism and violent extremism. And I'm proud to say that even with the holidays in August, at least in the Western Hemisphere, with holidays in Europe and, or I should say the Northern Hemisphere, we have over 200 professionals signed up for today's events. And it's so exciting. A lot of them are from the United States and European countries, but we have people signed up from as far away as Mongolia, South Africa, Somalia, Tunisia, India, Bangladesh, Australia, and Indonesia. And we're sorry for you that if you're staying up really late to take part, but thank you for joining. And it's really wonderful to have this worldwide group of people gathering, and we welcome you all. It's good to see many friends and colleagues among you, and I haven't looked at everybody yet, but we're happy to see you all. And we're happy to see some new ones. So last time we had an in-house panel, and we showcased some of our work on breaking the ISIS brand counter-narrative project, and we showed some of our short videos, and we shared how we do the, hi Alex, how we do the research for them and how we craft them into short videos. Zach Badorf isn't with us today, but he's going to edit this video and put it on the web, and he's one of our video editors. And then how we distribute them over Facebook and Instagram and study the results, which Molly Ellenberg is in charge of, and she's here as our master today. So you can still view that event on our ICSVE website under events, and we're posting these things in chat so you can see it there. And you can also watch the previous, I think it's 6 events there. And you can always see our short counter-narrative videos on our ICSVE YouTube channel. And today we're very blessed and lucky to have Jesse Morton with us. And he's going to speak about his own childhood trauma in brief and the effects that trauma has as a vulnerability to radicalization, and a little bit about his work as a jihadist propagandist and his work now too, I hope. So I'm afraid that time is going to be short, but I want to speak just a little bit. We haven't decided on our next event yet, and we're always open to suggestions. So if you know somebody really great, and we're trying to focus on practical things, you know, so it's academia hitting the road basically. And you can put your questions in the chat and your comments. So it seems like that gets pretty lively there. And 2 events back, we did have some inappropriate comments placed on chat. So we now know how to eject people. Molly can eject you. And so we're giving our fair warning. If you insult another person's religion, race, or ethnicity, or otherwise insult someone, I mean really insult them, we will eject you, and you won't, there's no questions asked, you'll be kicked off, and you won't be welcome to future events. So we know we're from all around the world, we have very diverse points of view, we're different religions, different ethnicities, but that's the coolness of this, that we have all these different diversity. So I hope we can treasure that in each other. And we will capture the chat, and we'll post it on the website, and we'll also send it to all of you. So don't worry, you don't have to try to copy the chat, you'll get it later. And we'll also, if there's questions posed, we'll attempt to answer them in brief. I mean, we're not gonna write you a research paper on a question, but we will attempt to answer what we can. And we're video recording so you can watch this later. So I always like to thank our sponsors. I have to thank our team, many who are not here with us today. And I also like to thank our sponsors, past and present. We've been sponsored by the US State Department, the European Union, UN Women, Facebook, private donors, and the state of Qatar. And I always like to give a really special thanks to Qatar because they've been so good in getting behind us on the Breaking the ISIS Brand Counter-Narratives project, enabling us to have now made 247 in-depth video interviews of ISIS defectors, returnees, and prisoners, and 16 more of al-Shabaab. And from those, we've created 201 short video clips of terrorist defectors, returnees, and prisoners denouncing their terrorist group as un-Islamic, corrupt, or overly brutal. And these are made by Zach Badorf, Sheikh Ali, and myself working in concert. And we keep working on them. We produce, I think, 2 a week, unless, one of us goes down for some reason. And we try to put them out in 27 different languages. So since we're a worldwide audience, if any of you would be willing to translate 50 lines of text for the videos, we would welcome that. Hi, Besser, I just see you signing on. And,
greetings.
And I would also say we're very grateful to Facebook for allowing us to run over 150 campaigns around the world in all these different languages, and to publish regularly about the results of running them. And all our reports are on our ICSVE website, so you can check that out and find things there. Let's see. I also want to highlight that we just published a recent paper, Molly and I. It's called Spontaneous De-Radicalization and the Path to Repatriate Some ISIS Members. We put that in Homeland Security, and a longer, more detailed academic report will be in a journal. But given the current debate over will we take these ISIS members from Northeast Syria home, it's interesting that we found that with the FDFs, 28% of the males and 52% of the females were already spontaneously de-radicalizing. And I think that's really significant. No program in place, but given that ISIS was territorially defeated, that they saw a lot of bad things in ISIS, a lot of them are starting to come around. And that's good news if we end up taking these people back to our countries. So as far as myself, I've been in-depth interviewing terrorists for 20 years, and I've talked to over 700 of them. And I'm a psychologist, so I'm always trying to understand their trajectories into and back out of terrorism. And I came up with 4 things that I think are necessary to make a terrorist, a group usually. Its ideology, social support for the group, and then on the level of the individual, vulnerabilities and motivations. And we have Eric Kruglanski here, who also has his model, which is very good. And we've all come up with trying to explain this in one way or another. I call this the lethal cocktail of terrorism, and you can see that paper in chat too. And in that paper, I identified 50 variables that relate to individual motivations and vulnerabilities. And one of them is trauma, along with a desire for belonging, purpose, significance, dignity, adventure, romance, material rewards, escape from life problems, revenge, and so on. 20 years ago, I attended one of my first NATO advanced workshops. It was in Lisbon, Portugal. It was wonderful. And I wrote about the concept of, or I presented at that NATO workshop, the idea of psychological trauma as a major vulnerability and motivator for resonating to the terrorist message and to joining a group. And I was literally laughed out of the room. I was told that I was a liberal psychologist, that everybody in conflict zones is traumatized, and it has nothing to do with why people would become terrorists. But as I was at that time mostly studying Chechens and Palestinians who lived in conflict zones, and many who had volunteered to become martyrs, I knew I was right. And in our Chechen sample, we had over 100 psychological autopsies of suicide bombers, and we found that all of them had a family member, a close associate killed. And when we went back over their stories, they were already dead. With family members and close associates, we found out that torture, death, really violent episodes, not so much childhood trauma in their cases, led to them wanting to revenge and being willing to join a group. Of course, they also had to have exposure to the group, and they had to somehow get ideologically indoctrinated into this martyrdom ideology. In Palestine, we found volunteers for suicide missions motivated by frustrated aspirations, humiliation, being unable to cross checkpoints, resulting in deaths, including deaths in childbirth, facing destroyed homes, occupation, imprisonment of family members, and deaths as major motivators for volunteering. So I was quite sure I was right about trauma, and I've kept writing about it over the years, and I think now, well, Alex, you're writing about it too, and many people are starting to take it seriously, and our military started to take it seriously. In Iraq, they understood that kicking down doors, they did have to go and arrest people, but they needed to be aware of their effect on the community, on innocent people, family members, and so on. And they tried to reduce their footprint to reduce the amount of trauma because they understood that this was motivating even more. Also, Jesse and I talked about this last week. We had a pre-meeting. As I interviewed failed and thwarted suicide bombers, I saw that the martyrdom ideology of the militant jihadist ideology closely fits with experiences of PTSD. It offers for people who are really suffering badly from PTSD, from traumatic flashbacks, from high arousal states. That's the agitation in the body, the jumpiness, the painful arousal, and the overwhelming psychic pain. It gave them a legitimate way to express their rage, enact revenge, legitimate in their eyes, I should say, make the other suffer as they did. And it was sold as a fast track ticket to paradise. And it also guaranteed relatives assurances of paradise, and in some cases, even monetary compensation from the group itself. And I started to see martyrdom as what I called short-term psychological first aid that ended in the death of the person, but offered them in their last moments of life as they prepared for their mission, a calm and purposeful present versus the chaos and the pain of PTSD. And I also found that for those who had sinned greatly, it was a balm for overwhelming guilt because they believed that all their sins would be forgiven in this act. Probably the most impressive moment for me was when I was in Israeli jail talking to a Palestinian who had waited for her suicide bomb for 6 weeks. And she recounted her story, and as she told her story, she started to get high. And I started to ask her questions about this because I was like, she looks like she's drunk. And she admitted to me, this is how I felt for the whole 6 weeks as I was waiting for my bomb. I would look at my family members and say, goodbye, Mom, goodbye, Dad, goodbye, Uncle. And she said, I just felt high, like I was already in paradise. And so in my understanding, she was literally drugging herself. Her brain was giving her probably an endorphin high. And she even re-experienced it in front of me as she recounted her story. At that time, journalists were also reporting about how suicide bombers that got caught said that when they put on their suicide vest or got ready for their bomb, that they also were feeling euphoric. So in Brussels, I was kind of the crazy professor. They used to call me Specky. And we decided to design a thought experiment. So we invited 19 international students to take part in a scenario, and we explained to them, we'd like you to role play. We'd like you to pretend you're a Palestinian, that you're living under curfew, that you're living under occupation, that you're angry over, you saw 2 Palestinian kids shot by an Israeli soldier. You don't know the circumstances, but you saw it on TV, you're angry. And we'd like you to pretend you volunteered for a suicide mission, and you went all the way to your target. And now you're in prison because you got caught at the last minute. And we're coming for an interview with you. Would you be willing to be in this role play? And all 19 students, because I was kind of known as the crazy professor, laughed and said, okay, why not? And but as they went into role, we took it slowly. We asked them, how is it being a Palestinian? And some of them didn't know anything about Palestine, but they just made things up. And we had only given them those first suggestions. And we took them all the way to, okay, well, you decided to sign up for the group. Why did you? How did that go? What did you pick as your target? And how did it feel when you got to the point that you put on the suicide vest? How did you feel? And the amazing thing was that 84% of the students imagined it in this role play with positive emotions. 74% described some kind of dissociative defense. So getting kind of stepping away from themselves, floating above themselves, feeling dissociative basically. And 37% reported it as feeling euphoric, feeling high, and 47% reported feeling all powerful. So we could induce this effect in normal students. I don't remember if any of them were Muslim. They were, we just gave them this idea, and we were able to induce this feeling. And interestingly, as I read the suicide literature, a lot of people that commit suicide film themselves, or they do audio recordings. And people that study these recordings find the same thing in suicide, that people, as they contemplate taking their own life, get euphoric. And it's probably what we have to do psychologically, that something in our brain has to overcome our survival instinct. And it might be like playing sports. Like when you twist your ankle really badly, you can keep playing because your brain will drug you for a while. and make you not feel the pain. So some of these students said it was like a dream. I floated along. I had muted senses, but I felt euphoric. Everything was at ease. It was like a drug. Or there were vivid, bright colors. I was cleansed of all doubt. My adrenaline was pumping. I noticed everything like in sports. Or I was very focused and I shut everything else around me out. And all I could see was getting to the goal. I wasn't afraid. I knew everything would be better afterwards. So we were amazed by this. And what it told me is that in conflict zones particularly, but also in non-conflict zones, because some people's families are conflict zones, some people's neighborhoods are conflict zones, that trauma is real and ubiquitous around the world. And where there's this militant jihadi narrative, if a recruiter is talking to somebody that's got a strong case of PTSD, where they're constantly battling bodily arousal, painful flashbacks, that they can be offered this drug called suicide terrorism, and it can deliver to them euphoric bliss, empowerment, a sense of belonging and joining a group, and a sense of purpose. And as I told you, I call this psychological short-term first aid, because it ends in your own death. It's only short-term. And Jesse, I don't know if it's accurate to say, has tasted this drug as far as what the militant jihadi narrative can offer you. He too comes from a background of extreme trauma in his childhood. He had a violent mother, and he too found militant jihadism as a balm for emotional suffering and an empowering tool. And I'm just going to quickly go through his bio. Jesse Morton was once a jihadist propagandist known as Yunus. He ran Revolution Muslim, a New York City-based organization active in the 2000s, and he was connected to a number of terrorism cases. He himself did not commit violence, but he was connected to Al-Qaeda's ideology, and he put it out as English language propaganda. He de-radicalized in 2011. He was arrested in Morocco, and he became a consultant with the government and with the police. He now runs Light Upon Light and Parallel Networks, and I'll let him tell you about that. And he's fighting hate and extremism in America. And like all of us, he's on a journey in his life towards health and wholeness. And Jesse's very smart. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree from Columbia University, and I think you are really going to enjoy hearing from him. So Jesse, I'm turning the floor over to you, and I wonder if you can just maybe start a little bit with childhood and your incarceration and how you found the militant jihadi narrative. And we want to hear from you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a thorough introduction, and it's an honor to be here and to see so many faces, some familiar, some unfamiliar in the audience. So thank you much. I guess I think the more and more work I do in the realm of violent extremism, whether it's in myself or whether it's with regard to others, I recognize the importance of grasping early childhood development and being able to understand a trajectory or a pathway into radicalization. I'm getting a bit of feedback, unfortunately, echo.
I'm gonna mute myself.
Sorry, yeah. So yes, that's better. So I guess my own trajectory really involves a need to assess the upbringing that I had. It was in some ways unique, but in so many ways in our society, not certainly something that we don't find common. I was born in a small town in Pennsylvania. That was the result of a relationship held by my father, who was a rich, sort of privileged kid from New Jersey, right outside of New York City. His father was said to be the youngest Supreme Court justice in the state of New Jersey, but he passed away suddenly from lung cancer during my father's senior year of high school. And my father had sort of an existential crisis where he was supposed to go on to college and to become a lawyer, but he sort of fell into the countercultural environment of that era and chose instead to go to a very small school called Susquehanna University, where he met my mother. My mother was a local, poor and underprivileged background, came from a largely rural area, not connected at all to a broader world. And they met, had a relationship, and conceived me. The situation was sort of awkward because my father continued to develop this countercultural perspective and ended up raising us in the middle of nowhere, maybe 20 miles from the closest town, on what would be a rented farmhouse where they grew their own marijuana in the woodshed, had hippies over quite regularly, and everything during the period of my birth was supposed to be ideal. They got married as a result of the pregnancy, but soon thereafter, right after my birth, my father started to sort of drift and started to cheat on my mother, started to become a workaholic, started to have a relationship outside of the house. And we never really saw him. And so we were in the middle of nowhere with a mother who certainly, I can say honestly, has genetic mental health complications for certain. Probably experienced her own trauma, but she began to resent my father so much that she started to turn inward and take her hate and her anger and her resentment out on the only things that she could, which were accessible to her, which were her children. And so the beginning of my radicalization process starts with the earliest memory that I have of my mother laying on top of me in an old farmhouse, suffocating me, the light pouring through the curtains in the big farmhouse windows, blazing down on my face, and me thinking that I was actually going to die, and me saying, mustering up enough strength, I don't remember how old I was, to say, "You're going to kill me, you're going to kill me, stop." That is the earliest memory and recollection that I have. And abuse like that continued throughout my childhood, and it was made really possible because nobody could hear us scream. Because we were out in the middle of nowhere, my father continuously realized that the idealisms that he held were unrealistic. He had become a construction worker, totally abandoned the idea of going on to become an attorney. And so we were living in this very awkward situation where there was not enough money to get a divorce as the years went by. And the archetype that developed and probably predisposed me to become a radicalizer and a recruiter occurs really at that in that space. And so what we know about dysfunctional families now is particularly appropriate for me. Dysfunctional families tend to have particular personas or archetypes, and I would have been the scapegoat, the one that everyone in the family sort of blamed for the dysfunction in the family. And then we had my perfect sister who would arrange things and try everything she could to be meek and mild and to avoid conflict, whereas the scapegoat or the black sheep would run into it, try to defend the situation, try to stand up to the oppressor, try to stand up to the abuser. And then there's always the child in this triad where the mother does not beat them, does not harm them, and that's a rationalization and a justification in her brain. She's not beating my younger brother, therefore there must be a reason why I am getting abused and why she's acting the way she is to me. And I became the ire of her absolute resentment, to the degree where the last time I spoke to her, she told me that she was glad she beat me, that I deserved it, and that my narratives in public are absolutely fraudulent. And so this continues to today. She cannot simply control herself, even when I try to reach out and connect with her. But that archetype, I think, is very important because a lot of the people that I work with, a lot of the people that I've known, a lot of the people that I've witnessed radicalizing the movement, particularly those that have gone on to become propagandists or preachers or to promote the ideology as opposed to act on it, have this sort of black sheep in their background, have this sort of stigmatizing sort of situation where they see themselves as bad, but they also see themselves as having more to offer. And so that's really what developed inside of me and my personality. I would rush in to rescue my sister from abuse. And so I saw myself as a self-sacrificial person who was willing to sacrifice myself for a better cause. I started to stand up to oppression. I started to tell my mother early on that she was going to stop. I started to stand up for us. And I developed a courage, but also that was due to the trauma, became really serious impulsivity with regard to addiction, with regard to an inability to control myself, with regard to a need to find outlets that were physical. And when I did not have outlets that were physical, such as sports, I would fall into really serious, sexual mischievous behavior and things of that nature. And I dealt with this my whole life and didn't understand it. I felt like I could feel feelings outside of myself and feel the feelings of others, but I also felt like I wasn't inside of myself. So I had this really serious dissociative characteristic where I was constantly living in the mind of my creativity and trying to analyze and understand in complexities why I was going through what I was going through. And that gave me the thought that I had really serious ability to analyze situations with complexity, but in actuality, it was really a lot of black and white thinking that impaired that ability. Now that I think back on it reflective. And so at the age of 15, long story short, having developed that archetype, I went into a guidance counselor at school and told him I was being abused. And he called my mother, long story short, into the office. She said I fought with my brother over that weekend and that I simply make stuff up. And so I had also been labeled as a black sheep at the school, and I was unbelieved. And I had absolutely had enough. I was ready to do violence against her and myself, so I ran away. And I took off to the streets of New York City. And I gravitated towards the same counterculturalist far leftism that my father uh, had originally upheld, because I was exposed to a lot of the music of the 60s, the books of the 60s, and sort of wanted to internalize that. But I had a very different perspective due to my upbringing. Even as a far leftist, I felt like passivity was probably not going to implement these sort of systemic changes. And I realized now that I wanted to tear down the world around me because the world didn't protect me. So rather than blame my mother, who I had to have unconditional love for, I blamed our society. I blamed America. And that requires a lot more conversation, but that's simply the attitude that I walked around with. And I lived with hippies. I ran away with the Grateful Dead, traveled with the Grateful Dead. I didn't have to see anything of American society during the late 90s except for rest stops on highways, driving between concerts. And I was able to completely tune out of society, and I felt comfortable in that. But I was always the hippie in the corner saying, I'm not a hippie. We need to be, doing more. And I would be at public libraries in Berkeley, California, just absorbing literature on the far left. And trying to identify an ideology outside of myself that could serve as sort of an opiate. At the same time, I was suffering from going from experimentation with hallucinogens to narcotics. And at the age of 18, I found myself incarcerated in State College, Pennsylvania, outside of a concert. And it was there that I was asked during my first stint in jail if I wanted to get a book from the library. And they took me downstairs, and the only thing I could find on the shelf was the autobiography of Malcolm X that was of interest. I went back to the cell and I read it 3 times in a row. Completely adopted the religion of Malcolm before I had any contact with the religion of Muhammad. Malcolm was amazing to me because he was traumatized, lived a criminal lifestyle, had sold drugs, went to prison, adopted an ideology that I didn't think was for me until I got to the chapter where he goes on Hajj and he sees white people with blue eyes, comes back, denounces Elijah Muhammad and becomes a Sunni Muslim before effectively becoming a martyr and a social justice warrior as far as I was concerned. I wanted to live that and manifested an ability to live that from the time they left me out of that jail stint. My first jail stint after 4 months, I started to read about religion, but I couldn't control my body. My body continued to flirt with addiction. My body continued to go to the counterculturalist hippie movement where I had family, where I had belonging, where I had a community. But I knew that I was getting worse and worse, started to find myself spending more time in inner cities, started to find myself using crack cocaine, using heroin, getting further down the hole that was addiction, and didn't quite find Islam until one day in Philadelphia where I was almost arrested with a North Philly Salafi jihadist who was selling drugs, having a little side life on his own. Long story short, he ended up getting into some trouble with me, taking me to his mother's, to his wife's house. She was a beautiful, good, practicing Muslim. I went to sleep, picked the Quran up on my way to the bathroom and read the first verse of Surah Al-Baqarah. This is a book wherein there's no doubt, a guidance for people who have consciousness. Continued to read, was overcome with emotion, absolutely tired of using drugs and alcohol, and felt like I had this sort of existential experience where the Iman or the faith of Islam had entered into me. I converted to Islam but didn't have a place to go, and so ended up stowing away on a bus to Richmond City the next day to sell fake narcotics outside of a concert parking lot where I was arrested for distribution to an informant. I knew I was going to go home soon, but I had to spend time in Richmond City Jail, where I was basically, prior to 9/11, met by a Moroccan recruiter who was a veteran of the Afghan Soviet Jihad, incarcerated in Richmond for fighting and for himself being able to not control his violent streak or tendencies. He taught me a religion that gave me stability and offered me a sense of, okay, I don't have to use alcohol and drugs any longer. He taught me the 5 pillars of Islam. And then one day he told me that you're actually ready to become a real Muslim now. You know how to pray in Arabic. I want you to go into the shower, wash every inch of your body. You're going to be like a baby. You're going to be born new. You're going to be cleansed of everything you've lived and experienced up until this point. And then he gave me a new identity. They put my hand on the Quran. I took the Shahada, and he gave me a new name. And I had come to hate everything I knew about Jesse Morton. So he told me that my new name was Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. Yunus, Jonah in the Bible, ignores God's commands, swallowed by the whale. He knew about my trauma. Swallowed by the whale, spit out, called all the people to Nineveh to Islam, and was the most successful of the messengers due to the fact that the trauma that he had experienced allowed him to transform into becoming a great preacher. Abdullah, that I'm only a slave of Allah, that I am essentially nothing without God, and Muhammad, that he is the one that needs emulated to a T. The radicalization did not start until a couple weeks later. We were praying in the cell block. Person that was a Christian woke up because we called the Adhan loudly for the morning prayer, stood in front of the prayer. He tried to move him out of the way. The Moroccan got up and fought him. And I had never understood any form of violence in spirituality or religion, but it was my first step into being recited in the back of the jailhouse, a hadith from the Prophet Muhammad. It says, if someone walks in front of your prayer, gently move them with your right hand to the side. If they don't move, get up and fight them, for certainly they are a devil. He recited this, and he told me that Muslims don't care about odds because he lost the fight. The individual is much bigger than him. Muslims do what's right. They stand up for justice. This resonated with this whole idea of standing up to oppression. And he told me about an impending war that would certainly ensue between the West and the Muslim world, largely because the Taliban had implemented Sharia law in Afghanistan. And basically from that point on time, I heard about the hadith of Black Flag will be raised in Khorasan. It will not be stopped until it reaches Jerusalem. That being something that appealed to me because I had adopted very far leftist perspectives of the Israeli state, was very pro-Palestinian already. So I felt like I had a community and something to belong to, though I had no community because they left me out of that county jail. And I completely transformed my life. Went to a Salvation Army in Syracuse when 9/11 happened. I was already desensitized, felt like we deserved it. Was ultimately kicked out of that Salvation Army for a different series of things, mostly for practicing my religion in a period of paranoia. I do understand in retrospect why that was the case. They sent me to New York City again, where I ultimately got Medicaid and entered into a program in Harlem, New York, run by people who had once been affiliated with Malcolm X. They ran an inpatient substance abuse clinic, a homeless shelter, an outpatient clinic, a healthcare center, after-school programs. They had this holistic, comprehensive nonprofit ecosystem that was quite amazing. And it was there that I found my first taste of Islamic community, walking the same streets that Malcolm walked. Started preaching on 125th Street when we went into the Iraq War, against the Iraq War, and mobilizing African Americans to convert to Islam and reclaim their original identity. Because I was a white guy with blue eyes, it was rather effective, and I knew how to speak. And so I was empowered. About a year after that, in 2004, in the summer, I went to the annual Muslim Day Parade, where I met the Islamic Thinkers Society, an offshoot of Al-Muhajirun, Omar Bakri Muhammad, and Anshum Chowdhury's group. And it was there that I really found the true Sunni diaspora's identity in the West. A lot of them were Southeast Asian, a lot of them were Arabic, and I finally got to this framework of ideology that was ultimately appealing because it was the Salafi jihadist perspective, or the Islamist perspective, at an extremist degree. Studied with that group, became one of their prominent preachers, and in 2007 decided that what they were doing was not online enough, and that they didn't know how to translate the message into a way that would impact Westerners. And so I proceeded to collaborate with Abdullah Faisal, who was recently, just a few days ago, extradited finally from Jamaica to New York City, where he will finally face charges for his role as one of the most violent and charismatic preachers of the post 9/11 era. And started an organization with him as the cleric and with an associate who was basically the clown. His name was Yusuf Al-Khattab. He was an Orthodox Jew who converted in Israel, joined the Palestinians, and had returned to New York City, where I had become very good friends with him, and basically positioned him as a YouTube sort of celebrity to do provocative things to get us attention. And so we had this triad of radicalization and propaganda, and Ann, you can cut me off at any time if I start to deviate. We had this sort of triad of propaganda where it was much in tune, now I realize in retrospect, with what like Malcolm Gladwell would call your salesman, your maven, right, and your networker. Like I was the one behind closed doors coming up to programming, reframing things so that they were like Al-Qaeda on Madison Avenue, positioning Abdullah Faisal as a cleric, as a legitimate authority, creating mechanisms to use platforms like Paltalk, where we could do 24/7 lectures and news and analysis and interactive discussions, building a website that didn't just talk about the religion, but also framed progressive politics and revolutionary politics in an Islamic way, thus the name Revolution Muslim. And Yusuf was appointed to get us thousands and thousands of YouTube hits by doing crazy stuff, holding up signs outside Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presentation at Columbia University that said, you know, may Allah make a mushroom cloud over Israel, getting punched in the face, filming it on camera, ending up on the front page of the New York Post, then being covered on Fox News, ripping the flag on American Street in Jackson Heights, getting on all of the mainstream press coverage, and doing anything we could to be as crazy as we could in public, so that what we would do is we would get a very small fringe set of extremists who would look at us as people who were standing up to the atrocities that the world was facing, they would migrate to the website where they would immediately be inundated, not with emotional material, but with rational material that would cement their identity. One-stop shop for ideology. We connected our organization to all of the main Western preachers, from Abu Adnan in Australia to Anwar al-Awlaki, who I knew well, to Anjem Chowdhury, to Abu Bara, to everyone who was basically a charismatic preacher during the age of charismatic preachers. And so for the first time, now they were united under a similar banner. We ran a room called Authentic Tawheed, which was run on a program called Paltalk, which, if anyone remembers when Snowden released the documents, a lot of people mocked the fact that Paltalk was on the list. But in fact, anybody who understands terrorism knows that Paltalk for a long time was a hotspot for al-Shabaab, al-Qaeda, and English language jihadist recruitment. And we used it in the same way that ISIS uses Telegram today. I worked and collaborated with Samir Khan and Anwar al-Awlaki to formulate the very first English language jihadi magazines. We called it Jihad Recollections. Jihad Recollections became Inspire magazine and then became Dabiq and Rumiyah. Jihad Recollections ran for 4 editions. It was produced by me and Samir Khan. I wrote the lead article for all of them. And what we did was we basically made it look like Vanity Fair for Al-Qaeda in the United States. We gave it glossy images. We concentrated on the emotions. We concentrated on the presentation and the emotional appeal, and worried about the more cementing of the hardcore narrative and the hardcore ideology by getting people to take that magazine and come on to the jihadist discussion forums. Then we were using Facebook, YouTube, comment section, and et cetera, to basically embed people in what was a 24/7 ecosystem. My organization ultimately threatened the writers of South Park for portraying promising to portray the Prophet Muhammad in a cartoon. It was eventually censored by Comedy Central because of our threats. It was a threat that ran around the world and ultimately induced not only Indonesia and Pakistan to shut down Facebook for a day or two, due to a woman in response in Seattle who still remains in hiding, starting an Everybody Draw Muhammad Day Facebook group where everyone would draw the Prophet. My colleagues, who were then the first propagandists to travel to join a foreign terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda, had been embedded with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Samir Khan and Anwar al-Awlaki, and they launched Inspire, which was the very first sort of English language charismatic preacher propaganda. But now it wasn't just the ideology. Now we had a death threat against Molly Norris, the one who started the Everybody Draw Muhammad Facebook page. And we had a recipe that many of us know how to build a bomb in Mom's kitchen, which has been utilized by people like the Boston Marathon bomber, appears on far right-wing boards as a recipe that they can use, and has really led to a lot of really damage from the time it was launched. And that was way back in 2010, early 2000. So basically, long story short, what we set up was a Salafi jihadi ecosystem that was framed in a way that was very much like Hollywood for Al-Qaeda. It really transformed the way that propaganda was distributed in the jihadist milieu. It was a byproduct of a directive from Abu Musa al-Suri, the strategist of Al-Qaeda, who was instructing Al-Qaeda to not become a hierarchical organization, to become decentralized, and to maintain itself with the dissemination of an ideology. Disseminating that ideology required people to say whatever they could wherever they were. They were speaking mostly to Arabs in the Middle East. However, we were American kids that adopted it, and we could say whatever we wanted. I was able to go outside of mosques and say I love Osama bin Laden more than I love myself, and to tell the imam inside of the mosque after he gave a khutbah on a Friday that he was a complete hypocrite, that he wasn't addressing the concerns that mattered to Muslims, and that they were sellouts to the American empire. Film that on video, upload it to YouTube, and get an immense emotional reaction from Muslims that said, yeah, we're tired of our imams not talking about these political concerns as well. And so in every single way, I think I was manipulative, had sort of adopted the dark triad of psychology, if you will. Narcissistic tendency, feeling good if I was able to watch people absorb my ideology. Wasn't really just about manipulating people, because I was a believer, a true believer to the utmost degree. Certainly had this psychopathology of living detached from myself, because what Islam did, I knew in retrospect, it got me away from the addiction. But the same person that was prone to become an addict because he couldn't control his behavior because he was traumatized, was now finding the opiate to be this ideology that he was fascinated with and enthralled with and completely kept entranced with. But the stability that Islam gave me also allowed me to function as Jesse Morton in my real life, where I was getting those degrees from Columbia. I became the manager of an outpatient substance abuse clinic in Brooklyn, New York. I was highly successful when I could turn off that addiction, but then I'd slide away into the evenings, and then increasingly so as time went on, to the ideology where I became more and more prominent charismatic preacher myself as time went on. Ended up running away to Morocco after threatening the writers of South Park, living there for a year before the United States government arrested me, and was fortunate enough to withdraw from the network. I had to stay low. I knew that I was going to be arrested. I didn't want to get anyone in trouble. So I disappeared for Ramadan. My ex-wife was from Morocco, Casablanca. I really liked the Moroccan culture. I really liked the millennial Arab youth, teaching them GMAT, GRE prep. The Arab Spring broke out. We had many, many conversations, some of which were ultimately enthralling. One woman really challenged my views and my perspectives. And I started to really understand that I had become an authoritarian dictator, whereas my original roots didn't believe in forcing things on people from above. So I became sort of a stepping stone away, an Islamist, but was open to more different ideas. I was ultimately arrested 3 weeks after Osama bin Laden was killed in Abbottabad. I was picked up coming outside of a small Salafi jihadi mosque in sort of the alleyways of Casablanca, if you will, and was picked up, taken to a Moroccan jail in Rabat, Saleh, a very famous place that a lot of Salafi jihadists have been housed since the Casablanca bombings, 2003, 2005, and met Mohammed Fizazi, who was on his way out of prison, who had de-radicalized, quote unquote, de-radicalized, and was about to be let out by the king, couldn't say everything that was going on, but did walk me around a courtyard and asked me not about the ideology, but he asked me about my personal life. And he asked me why I threw away my life for something that I didn't have any trained actual knowledge on. And it really like snapped me. I was facing life in prison, came back and was flown back to the United States by the US government on a private plane. And in the course of doing so, just basically admitted my guilt and knew that I was probably going to face life in prison. They told me that they were going to go back and hit additional charges apart from the South Park stuff, and that my conspiracy with Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan would ultimately cost me life in jail. I was returned to Virginia, to the Eastern District of Virginia, where I was housed in solitary confinement. And being housed in solitary confinement is tough, but there was a compassionate guard there that would take me 4 days a week for her 10-hour shifts that I developed a friendship with. And so I'd spend about 32 hours a week in the law library, which was also the home to the jailhouse library, where I started to read the Encyclopedia Britannica's Great Books of the Western World, which was compounded with biographies of the founding fathers. I really dove into Daniel Kahneman and Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Somebody had donated their books on the shelf. And it was in the middle of the Occupy movement and all of this like post-Arab Spring world of momentum for like, wow, the Middle East is democratizing. And I really fell in love with Enlightenment philosophy and with critical thinking, and reestablished an ability to think for myself, having been taught that I wasn't qualified to think and could only memorize from the scholars that I selected through confirmation bias and whatnot. And I'd go back to the cell without those books because I couldn't take them with me, and all I had was Quran and Hadith. And so I started to read the Quran again, but through a post-Enlightenment perspective. And so I pled guilty to 3 charges, capping me at 15 years. During the debriefing process, it happened that the Syrian civil war became Syrian jihad, and a lot of my students were starting to migrate to Iraq and to Syria, and a lot of the other propagandists that I was affiliated with began to do so. Through the course of my incarceration, me and the FBI developed a very interesting relationship, advising on CVE, the earliest manifestations of CVE in the country, working with the Behavioral Analysis Unit to try to talk about radicalization. I found them to be absolutely amazing people, not concerned with waging a war on Islam, but concerned with understanding how to better combat the fringe extremists that go on to carry out violence in the name. Shattered the us versus them perspective, took me another step down the road. And ultimately, after originally being sentenced to 11.5 years in prison, the judge who called me to the front of the courtroom the day he sentenced me and said he had heard good things and he hoped to be able to let me out someday, that I could become a positive voice, released me on March 1st, 2015, having only served 3 years and 9 months. While I was there, the Boston Marathon bombing happened, and they used the recipe that I helped to disseminate in the magazine that I helped to create to do it. And I vowed then and there that not only would I not be a radical anymore, but I would try to do something with my life that could make amends for what I had caused. And in the search and quest to do that, I first operated as an informant because we were able to craft a narrative that, I mean, I told the FBI nobody would ever believe I would de-radicalize. We can do whatever you want. And I did. I went public, pretended that I had beat the case and had gotten a sentence reduction. My old scholars and all of the crew accepted me with mostly open arms. There was some doubt in the community. Was able to navigate back into the community, thwarted a potential beheading and a case of travel abroad in the local area. Kids that had reached out to me that were jihadists, and they were arrested. And at the bond hearing, they hired an activist imam to come in and make the claim of entrapment, like they always do. And they said my name in court. And that led a Washington Post reporter, despite being told to strike it from the record by the judge, to release that the feds were now working with me as a confidential informant, and I was a former jihadist, so I was outed. Was having a hard time reintegrating, but eventually went public as America's first former jihadist with the program on extremism at George Washington University. Felt really honored and felt like I had arrived. I had de-radicalized. The ideology was gone. Everything was fixed. Everything was beautiful. The rest of my life was destined to make it possible for me to make amends. And I was honored. They were great people. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. In my very first interview, I mentioned the fact for the first time I never talked about the abuse as a child. And I was asked when my radicalization process started by reporter Rukmini Callimachi at the New York Times. And I thought about it, and I had to say the child abuse. And so that made it into the final story. My mother sent me an email that said, "Fuck you, happy interviewing," all caps. That was the only response I got. I think it was a plea from my mother to actually acknowledge what she had done. I spiraled, was overworked, stressed out, didn't have confidence in my ability to perform as a research fellow. Went to speak with people like Jessica Stern, and she told me, "You're traumatized. If you don't deal with your trauma, you're going to mess up." And I did. I blew up. The ideology was gone. The opiate of ideology was gone. But the things that made me an addict were still there. And slowly started drinking with others in the field, then migrated to cocaine and relapsed, threw it all away, and was reincarcerated again in another cycle of self-destruction. And now, from the time that I've recovered from that, I've been slowly but diligently working on becoming more aware of the role that trauma plays in radicalization, and have built myself up to a point where I've dealt with my trauma to the degree where I'm comfortable working with others. And I now run a fairly fledgling, but very successful and experimental and sort of innovative nonprofit organization called Parallel Networks. We run an ecosystem in the United States and also work in providing consultancy for international peace building and CBE projects. But we have really tried to create an ecosystemic approach that sort of reverse engineers what I built at Revolution Muslim. And I actually do that with the former director of NYPD, director of intelligence, Mitchell Silber, who monitored me for about 5 years of my life. And ultimately, I would say that Mitch has been one of the most crucial components of me being able to finally, after thinking that I had quote unquote de-radicalized way back in 2014, 2015, to say that I'm on a trajectory today that if I maintain the direction that I'm moving in and the things that we're doing, I get to wake up every day and feel like I have a chance to be driven by the same sort of passion and creativity that made me a good, effective Western propagandist, but also to slowly but surely, not that I'll be ever able to in totality, but to work every day to try to make amends, and to do such work to make amends in a healthy, productive way that also prevents my own self-destruction and self-sabotage, which has been the cycle that has marked my life and marks the cycle of many lives that suffer from complex or early development trauma. I hope that wasn't too long.
Thank you. I wonder if you can comment a little bit about well, there's so many things. One, when you're the family scapegoat, there's so much shame inside. And there's good research on shame, even in little babies, that when babies are calling out to their mothers, if the mother is told to take a stone face and pretend she doesn't hear her baby and not respond, the baby will show an affect of shame. It'll avert its eyes, and and for me, that tells me that shame has a lot to do with being disconnected, and that the answer to shame has a lot to do with positive attachments. Yeah, you can relate to that.
I mean, I can certainly relate to the attachment issue. I certainly suffered from sort of what might be called attachment disorder, and toxic shame has marked a lot of my life, and probably was one of the primary ingredients of creating that utopic, euphoric-like feeling, because I felt like I was transitioning that shame into something productive by being a jihadist, but it was marred by being stuck in fight, flight, freeze, and not being able to get outside of the simplistic viewpoint that is held in a person like that. So what I've had to learn how to do is to identify the attachment disorder, which is relatively new space for me. I have seen it manifest in thinking about relationships, anxious avoidant. My reaction to my attachment disorder was to become overly anxious and to cry out for mom to recognize, to come hold me, as opposed to developing a coping mechanism of shutting down. And it was that anxiety and that anxiousness that led me to adopt that personality that was like standing on the street on 96th Street in Manhattan and saying, I hate the United States. I know that I look like you, but you guys are going to be conquered by Osama bin Laden someday. Black flag over the White House, right? Very similar, but it manifests itself in relationships that I constantly can only fall in love with the avoidant one who is suffering from attachment disorder as well, but reacted in a very different manner. And so those anxious avoidant relationships that we're starting to learn about in that space are true, not just for like thinking about relationships, but it's actually true for like the people that you recruit, and your opposition to like people that you're engaged in. Like in-group fighting and extremism is full of anxious avoidant personality clashes and conflict. That's a whole nother subject. I think with regard to the toxic shame, there's the way that I reconcile it now and realize where I'm at is that there's a serious distinction between shame and guilt. That guilt can make you feel regretful for what you've done, even though you can realize that there's very little you can do about it because you're traumatized. And due to your circumstances and whatever it was, you can be a little bit easier on yourself. But when it's guilt and it's not shame, you can make amends because you can successfully and healthily retransition that and say, oh, but all of those things that I did when I was traumatized, I'm a really resilient individual. I'm a creative individual. I'm a person who can apply that same skill set, and I can apply my hard work, my dedication, my passion, my ability to make people feel like they belong to something, and I can do it for good. And in order to get to that space, you have to be able to process and be aware of toxic shame and how it does come out of oftentimes and most often that whole relationship with the mother, which is a period you can't even really remember.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
I wonder, that's such a good answer. You're so articulate about yourself and really so open. I wonder too, if you labeled yourself as narcissistic and enjoying your success, but for me, I wonder, and you also talked about having a new identity conferred to you. And that's something that we do even before we remember, that we start to build an identity. And if we get a secure attachment, at first we're attached to a parental figure, but eventually it's internalized and we have that kind of coping that we feel that we're worthy, and we know that we can relate to other people even if we're alone and anxious, instead of having this anxious attachment of, oh no, you know, are you going to run, or finding people that reject you because you were rejected. But it sounds like you tried to build this identity, and you also sound like you're proud of what you did. I mean, you were very smart and you built an amazing network, even though you were, you know, disseminating how to build a bomb in the kitchen of your mom. Can you talk about that at all, about the need for identity and the need for, you know, feeling that you have any worth?
I mean, I think it's good that Dr. Kruglansky is in the audience, because I think that really breaks down, and simplistically, not to take anything away from your model, but I do
no, that's fine.
Yeah, I do like to, I do think that breaking it down essentially into needs, narrative, and network is important, right? Because I had needs, society wasn't providing answers. I felt like I had more to contribute. I felt like I was somebody of significance, and I started to see these class grievances that are really coincident, particularly to the far right situation we see today, where I was like, if I was born into a privileged family with the IQ that I have, and you know, I was shipped to like special schools and stuff, so I felt like I was like smart enough that I should be recognized. I didn't want to do the work to be balanced and do the responsible things to get the recognition. So I felt like oppressed and like something was taken away from me. And the jihadist narrative is ideal for that because it's full of repentance. It's full of this idea that the kuffar will never accept anything from you. But now, instead of success being attained in a real life, real world, practical and pragmatic level, I was successful because God had chosen me to be a Muslim. And not only had he chosen me to be a Muslim, but as the jihadists taught me, or the ideology taught me, my needs would be answered, right? Because I was part of this chosen sect. 72 sects from amongst the Jews and Christians, 73 sects from amongst the Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad said, will exist in the end of times. Only one of those 73 sects of Muslims is in paradise. And they said, oh, Prophet Muhammad, what sect is that? And he said, the sect that is what I and my companions are upon. This is the cornerstone of Salafist, epistemology, where now you're not living in 2020 anymore. You're living in the 7th century. And Islam is about to become, is about to have global conquest because all of the conditions are ripe for very small numbers accepting the true religion. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this war of attrition against the great West and the great Satan will be victorious. You might not get victory or see the resurrection of the caliphate in this lifetime, but you will contribute to it in the same way that the Prophet Muhammad didn't get to see the fruits of his own efforts, because this is not about the world, this is about the hereafter. And you can get martyrdom in the way by speaking, fighting, or giving money in the way of jihad. So this narrative fulfilled this need of significance and belonging, right? And then the network cements this identity fusion where, like, I didn't know much. The very first conversation I had with an al-Muhajirunist, I met them at the Muslim Day Parade. I'm standing beside, I'm radicalizing on my own with books in Harlem, on the internet. And I'm standing behind this Pakistani American Muslim, has his one side of his face painted green, the other side of his face painted red, white, and blue, has an American flag and a Pakistani flag coming out of his backpack. I'm disgusted. And I'm waiting for a shawarma, and I turn to my left, and here during in one of the booths is the black flag raising, blowing in the wind, right? And I walk up to it, and it's the classic Dawa stall technique of al-Muhajirun, where there's a generator powering a video camera on a table. George Bush says, this crusade is going to take a while. Out of context, nothing else. Dead pictures of Muslims, T-shirts, I love jihad in Arabic, pictures of the caliphate system as the solution, all of the Middle Eastern puppets being walked, blah, 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 all of this propaganda. And I'm taken to a mosque the next day because I walked up to them and I was like, I didn't know you guys existed. I want to join you. I didn't even look at any of the literature. You guys have to be what's for me. And I go into a mosque and there's an individual sitting there on the floor, laying down, laptop popped. And all I saw for the first hour and a half was images of dead Muslims across the globe, right? And these people then came in and they brought the person who was the friend of Omar Bakri Muhammad, who had came here to start the movement, and they brought the other leader. And soon there's 5 people in the mosque, right? And I'm asking questions. I'm opposed to this idea of suicide operations, and they're answering my questions in the framing of Islamic history. I didn't accept it right away. But the most important component of that first meeting was, after we talked ideology, we went and we ate at an all-you-can-eat Chinese halal buffet. And immediately I had an entire group around me that I felt loved me because I was a Muslim, and I had never been able to let anyone get to know me in my entire life because of my defense mechanisms. So these became the very first people that I revealed my life to, because it was a good way to talk about why Islam is the answer. And they loved the narrative. Like Southeast Asian people walking down the street in Jackson Heights, hearing me talk about as a white blue-eyed American, about why Islam was the answer for me and why all Muslims should be radicalized, quote unquote, and oppose the war on terror. It was a very effective way of making people stop. We had so many people stop outside the Dawah stalls when I would speak that the police would have to come and create a corridor on the street. And so it was a very effective phase. And migrating into that network surrounded me with people that gave me a Salafi jihadi ideology that I could absorb. And I fused my me, that at least that part of me that was Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, which was increasingly becoming more and more the real me, became the movement. Like even if I had a thought that was my own, it would have been rejected by my brain. unless it was checked against the principles and the ideology that drove the movement. So
And
I
can you,
guess that was full-blown
and,
identity fusion.
okay, can you talk about how much, you said you were angry at America because America hadn't saved you. And I think many abuse victims feel that. Like, where were my aunts and uncles? Where was my church or my mosque? Where was my local police? Where was my high school or my elementary school? I mean, didn't anybody notice that I was getting beat up as a kid? And just extreme anger and hurt over that. But then if you get introduced to a movement that's going to save victims, it becomes so powerful because you're saving yourself, right? And can you talk about that fusion? Because Scott Atran says, he talks about the fusion. I don't know if you've read his work.
Sure.
But one thing that I really disagree with Scott is he says once you've fused with a group, it's almost impossible to unfuse. And you're an example of somebody that did separate again from this fusion. But certainly it meets needs. You know, it's a narrative, as Ari has said, it's a narrative and it meets your needs. I mean, for significance, for belonging, for rage, for anxiety, modulation. But could you talk a little bit about that, identifying with other victims and that fusion and how you can break the fusion?
Yeah, I think the problem with Scott's framework is that he assumes that there's only one self. And I think that when you, right? So if there's only one self, then the self is fused with the group, but we're not one self. We have parts that are competing to predominate over others, and they're constantly communicating. And we know this empirically almost, right? With regard to internal family systems and with regard to the attachment, all of these things that we're learning about trauma. I think when we talk about violent extremist experts that aren't up to date on the realm of trauma and neuroscience, it mars their interpretation. And so if you know how to communicate with the different parts, like I can literally at this point, once I develop a rapport with another extremist that I'm trying to impact, I can identify their parts and I can make one part play off the other if I want to, because I am a manipulative recruiter, right? So I have the ability to do this in reverse. And it's very true. That is the case. The identity is fused, but only when you're talking to that person. And when you get them out of the milieu and you get them over on a direct message platform where they're by themselves, then that persona that they are online that seems to be fused with the self is totally different. Right? So being aware of the dynamics of what we're learning about trauma and the neuroscience of trauma is very important, because think of counter messaging. Counter messaging, we started counter narrative with rational narratives, right? We've learned, and your work totally does not make.
Actually wanted to ask you about that, about emotions, because I felt that we need to battle on the space of emotions.
Yeah,
and
at least initially. Yeah, at least initially, but the problem is rational arguments, communications in the prefrontal cortex. But what we know about like prejudice and in-group out-group bias is that people that are traumatized communicate first. They receive information in the amygdala, external stimuli. But that if that information makes sense and creates some sort of spiritual or emotional attachment, they cement the argument that's implied already in their prefrontal cortex. And so deconstructing that and is important to recommunicate through the emotions and to take a person back out through an emotional and spiritual means. But the problem is if they see a message that has the potential to do that, we need to give them the quest, right? So we have the hero, the villain, the quest model that we know works. The problem is we have messages that can appeal to them. The question then becomes, what do I do now? So you have to create an opposite psychosocial support group that basically provides meaning, significance, and all of the needs, narratives, and network phenomena that are associated with the processes of radicalization. That's de-radicalization because it's more social than it is individual, right? In the long term. But the disengagement space can be exploited if you can hit the emotion, hit the spirituality, get a person alone so they're not their online persona. Like I absolutely refuse to talk over social media, absolutely refuse, because it's not the real person. It's the part of the person that is able to say whatever they want and is looking to get lost in dopamine rewards from other people. It's not a real human being essentially that you're talking to. It's the person that we are outside of ourselves. And so I think for all of those reasons, that's one of the primary important, it's the most important component of talking about trauma and its interrelationship with radicalization and violent extremism, because a lot of it intuitively makes so much sense when you look into the realm of trauma, but we don't have enough research on what components of that apply and what interventions might work. And I think in the same way that in general, I think the liberal world order needs a paradigm shift that's largely trauma conscious in order to save itself. I definitely think that there's a lot of contribution in the realm of violence, extremism, and terrorism studies can give to inducing a trauma conscious society, because we are increasingly seeing the variables associated with susceptibility to violence extremism prevalent at rates the likes of which we haven't witnessed in quite a long time. So I view the way that I see sort of this space, like Albert Einstein said, that no problem has ever been solved at the same level of consciousness that created it. And I think that a lot of times what we do, even intuitively, with like base rate bias and other biases that creep into the realm of research, is it's not, as one person has put it, it's not research, it's me search. A lot of people project their own selves into their research, right? And their assumptions and their view of the world is equally as us versus them in some ways, as the extremists they tend to impart a better understanding of, thereby the low base rate bias that creeps in as a result of that, and the tendency to isolate on the killers and not understanding the radicalized milieu and how to treat with it, deals with the countereffectual consequences of CVE policies, counterterrorism policies, and the like. The answers to all of that, I think, are in the realm of trauma-informed care at an institutional level, and also just learning about trauma-specific and neuroscientific breakthroughs that we're experiencing. So I don't know if I've deviated from your question.
No, not at all. And we call our project Breaking the ISIS Brand. And what we try to do is use insiders like yourself. I mean, you're telling the story, and I think it's so credible because you lived it. So, why wouldn't someone believe you that's also in it? And we always try to emphasize why the person went into ISIS, what their grievances were, because those grievances are real. And there's so many researchers that don't want to admit that the grievances are real. And especially in Europe, it's really hard to be Muslim. In Tunisia, you'll be unemployed. You can't get married. I mean, things that are really true and difficult for young men and for women. So as we went along, I started to think, okay, you break somebody, they are believing that this is going to be an answer for them, that it's going to give them significance, that it's going to give them a group, or it is giving them a group. But if you somehow break that or create doubt, what have you done? And you do have to redirect the person. So we created a website, and it's just fledgling, but I don't believe websites protect people. I believe other people and people caring about you and redirecting you. So I wonder if you could talk about this quest and maybe what you're doing in Parallel Networks to put people on a positive quest. Because way back when, I remember thinking, we need to create a Muslim youth Peace Corps. We need to be sending people out to address the things that they think are wrong in the world in a good way, because otherwise Al-Qaeda will do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Ken Reedy very well. We talked, and one of the things that I've said for a long time, and we did some work with an organization, a peace-building organization called Equal Access, where we talked about reorienting radicalization and considering radical neutral term, and being able to reorient it. And Ken's work arrived at the concept of benevolent radicalization, along with his work with you as well, greatly influenced by that. And that's really what we aim to do at Parallel Networks. We realize that in the realm of CVE, we operate in silos, and we operate with people that, while well-intentioned, absolutely incorporate a lacking awareness of cognitive biases, particularly awareness to the School of Heuristics by Daniel Kahneman. And you can see it in the consequences of what they call for and in the programming that they develop, particularly as practitioners. So there's a concentration on either one realm of the social science spectrum. They either do counter messaging, they either do intervention, they either do prevention. What jihadists do, and extremists in general do, is they do all of them at the same time. So you hear the message, and then you're embedded into the information environment in the network, where you absorb all of the specifics, and you're immediately tasked with something to do, a role in the organization, and it's your efforts that allow you to be promoted. And only through your connection to either a node or a hub in the network, right? You begin to jump through levels of like studying and levels of becoming aware and levels of moving along this progression. Particularly now it's harder for the jihadists, but we were able to do whatever we wanted. So we, because we weren't taken down off social media and whatnot. So what we decided when Mitch and I set out thinking about how to develop this thing, we call ourselves Parallel Networks because we do think that the only way to combat a network is to rival in size and scope that network first. And that efforts should be made to measure the development of a network that rivals in size and scope extremist networks. That way you can do M&E, like measure engagements between your network and the other network and the people that come out, and effective models for M&E and complexity can be built in over time. But we also don't believe in empiricism driving practice because there's not enough data and because terrorism is so fluid that we wanted to learn by doing, and created a theory of change in our heads that basically we've tested a lot out, not formally because we don't have a whole lot of funding, but we've been tinkering with these hypotheses, like, for example, can former extremists be the best interventionist, or maybe, what does that look like? And flirting with this really idea. And so we built a paradigm called Light Upon Light, which is attention to the Quran. And it's a concept in the Quran that allows us to tap into a higher level of consciousness and concentrating on those grievances at a higher order of consciousness, mostly, peace and nonviolence. The paradigm that we put forth at Light Upon Light is comprised of different intersectional programs that formulate a ecosystemic or a holistic approach that has activity demarcated along every piece of the social science spectrum that could equate to a CVE spectrum or a PCVE spectrum as well. So we have our messaging brand is Control, Alt, Delete, Hate, to control the space between stimulus and response, to alt course, to take your violent extremist understanding of the world, to make a commitment to nonviolence due to the awareness that it's futile, that even in Hadith, Quran, or whatnot, or even with regard to pragmatism or whatever, nonviolent efforts to address grievances have been much more successful in the long term, blah, blah, blah. We try to reorient that radicalization in that space. And then delete hate, to use those voices that we impact or those that we affect that were never extremists, to become aware that violent extremism, hate, polarization are all interrelated, and that we are essentially taking a liberal world order for granted that is certainly in danger, and trying to impart a better awareness that the quest for everybody to act in now is to overcome polarization, hate, and extremism. So to mobilize general publics to do something. And that's our messaging paradigm. It formulates into and it connects to the intervention component, which is called Shift Hate, which stands for Support and Help for Individuals and Families Touched by Hate. 24/7 helpline, basically my phone. You can email, you can contact us, and you can get access 24/7 to a set of interventionists that we put together that includes former extremists, survivors of extremism, professional trauma care provider volunteers, mental health practitioners, all of this that we've already established. And what we do is, instead of just counter messaging our friends, we embed the Control, Alt, Delete, Hate, Counter Narrative campaign into the extremist networks, because we do recognize their grievance. We do take an empathy-based approach, and they'll talk to us. They won't talk to someone who went from far right to far left and is now considered someone on the other side, and they see as equally extreme, just holding a different ideology. We do walk those grays in between the blacks and the whites, and therefore they will talk to us, and they have access through Shift Hate. And then we embed the counter-narrative material creatively. So we took back the jihadist template with an online e-zine that is embedded in Telegram, blah, blah, blah. We do it for the far right. We have a constant stream of counter-narrative work, even though it's largely just grassroots stuff that we do spontaneously as we move. That works to create to rival in outputs, extremist outputs, and to get enough information that there's a consistent flow of activity, so that if they see our message once, they might not acknowledge it, but through repetition, they know that Light Upon Light exists, and that we're different, because we get just as much criticism from far right as from the far left as we do from the far right. Which is good for us, because our objective is disengagement of those that could go on to commit violence. We're not looking to get rid of Donald Trump as president, or to, overthrow capitalism and replace it with things that some people in our society advocate for these days. So
Thank you,
the Shift Hate.
Jesse, let's just stop for a minute, because we're going to run out of time.
Oh,
and I
sorry.
think we could talk for 5 hours.
Let
And
me
everything. Oh, go ahead.
let me just finish the ecosystem real quick so
Yeah,
that
yeah.
it's holistic. So the Shift Hate connects to our psychosocial support group comprised of our interventionists and a lot of people that support our work called Society Against Violent Extremism and Hate. That's where we can take a person that we intervene with, put them in a new network, give them a new sense of significance, let them write for the magazines, let them give counter propaganda, do interviews, help with researchers, and get that new sense of significance. And then the Escape Hate allows us to take that once the de-radicalization process is progressing, we can take it into Escape Hate, which is our prevention component, where the individual can then speak to schools, can go on panels, can contribute to research, or whatever their skill set that they contributed to the extremist movement was, they can reorient it and give it to the light of light. So.
Well, even though you were a bane to your mother, it sounds like you're a blessing to the world at this point.
We hope so. Yeah.
I think so. I want to ask Dr. Kraglansky if you'd like to say anything after listening to this. I think, are you unmuted?
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. This was really extremely interesting and insightful and well told. An amazing journey, Jesse. And you have done, a lot with your life that is of extreme value. I was wondering whether you could elucidate your shift from what went wrong with your adherence to extreme Salafism. You were so successful at it. Everything seemed to have been going well. What precipitated this opening to the possibility that you may be in the wrong? You mentioned meeting two people that questioned your beliefs. One was a woman that suggested that maybe you're authoritarian, and that idea somehow penetrated the shield of your encapsulated ideology. And the second one was a person that you met in prison, Muhammad Aziz, or somebody of that nature. So this was meeting these two people. Could you expound a bit on what facilitated the shift?
So not just the meeting of people, because you wouldn't be receptive to meeting people unless it unfolded in a particular context. So we could take your modeled needs narrative network. My needs were beginning to be adjusted because I ran from potential prosecution in the United States to Morocco. And the context changed because I was talking with Arab millennial youth who, rather than study the Middle East from Columbia University, I now was living amongst them. And I was finding out that their passion and their creativity are, particularly amongst Moroccans, who are very, very amazing. And I really liked the culture. It changed the network around me because I couldn't communicate with the movement for a time being because of the controversy and me not wanting to raise attention till I determined and figured out what I wanted to do. So my network changed. There wasn't as frequent conversation with the preachers, not because I made a choice, just because of haphazard circumstance. And then in order to provide for myself, I had to teach the Arab millennial youth GMAT, GRE to make enough money to survive. And in the course of that, the Arab Spring broke out, which created a narrative that was, wow, like we are trying to liberate the Middle East as jihadists. Here, the people are standing up for themselves and they don't really want anything to do with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, right? And so the things that I took for granted became even more apparent. And then here is these smart Arab millennials who are like trying to wonder why this kufied, long-bearded fundamentalist who can teach, GRE and GMAT and is clearly very intelligent is a Salafi jihadist. One woman took enough likening to me that she recognized me in a way that no other woman had actually ever done, because I have that anxious, personality that tends to become enthralled by women that treat me like shit. And this woman saw me for who I really was, and kept challenging me like, this is not you, this is not you, this is not you. You're different. You don't understand. So in the context of the Arab Spring and the fact that I was removed from the network, that voice was able to make do. I would have considered her an absolute hypocrite if I was still talking to Abdullah Faisal every day. That's important to point out. And then, I think that, we have to get better at exploiting and recognizing context and conditions. Immediately when I see in the press an extremist shamed or an extremist incarcerated, I reach out right away, because it's that space that they're most prone to accept an argument for disengagement, and to establish someone who cares about you when you're embarrassed or when you're shamed and truly cares about you. If it's actual embodiment of empathy and no sort of manipulation behind it, they can feel that. And that's the best time to walk a person down. I believe that Mohammad Fizazi, who was a famous Salafi jihadi cleric, was sent by people affiliated with the Moroccan government or in conjunction with the US, because he paid his way to get from one part of the jail to the other, wanted to find the American Al-Qaeda. I was on the front page of the Moroccan press as American Al-Qaeda, and walked me around like hand in hand for like 6 days. And then while I was there, he was released. Nobody knew he had changed. He had to keep it secret because the Salafi jihadists were all through the jail. And he wrote an op-ed in the Moroccan newspaper that denounced what he had previously believed in. And it shocked the world. But I got the sense from his communication that he was talking to me. I wondered why he wasn't talking to me about Tawhid al-Hakimiyya and other principles, if in fact things were changed. But I think he had actual upbringing in Islam. And I think that he knew that the important thing to do to plant a seed was to talk to me about me. And I've always taken that. Like when people talk to me about ideology and they reach out and they threaten to behead me or something, immediately I try to transition them to talking about themselves, not where they're located or anything that might get them in trouble, but so who are you? Like, at least let me know if you're going to behead me when the Islamic State is captured, like who you are, who you are. Tell me about you. And consistently in interventions, I try to take conversations about ideology to conversations about person, and conversations about person and experience to conversations about ideology. Because I find that it's really helpful to make a person connect the we that we are, the part of ourselves that is extremist, with the ideology in a way that they can own it in their body, right? And I guess it takes an ability to connect those two things with a comprehensive understanding of the ideology. So to answer your question and not to continue to ramble, those two relationships were crucial, but in a different context, without the hope that the Arab Spring created and the wave of just the whole world was mesmerized, and it was one of our objectives as jihadists. I don't know if I would have reversed course.
So Jesse, thank you. That's a great answer. You're just so articulate about your experience. We have Alex Nessick here too, who's a good friend of yours and a psychologist and very informed about trauma. Do you have anything you'd like to say, Alex, or that you'd like to ask?
Thanks, Anne, so much. Jesse, good to see you. Thank you. Yeah, Jesse and I have done a lot of work in this trauma space. And I actually wanted to ask you a question. I don't know if you wanted to talk about this, but I think maybe the audience will be very interested in understanding when we did the internal family systems method. And if you could talk about when we walked you from, you know, there was Jesse Morton, and then there's Yunus Muhammad, and then we came back to Jesse Morton, and that process of identifying the parts, because we're talking about trauma, and now a lot of people are picking up the interest, and we're still not addressing the trauma in a way that is universally understood or using the same methodology. And I found that methodologies that I've used with Jesse and other people work very well in terms of identifying these parts that we were talking about. So Yusuf Muhammad being a part that was actually a protective part towards Jesse Morton, because Jesse Morton was not as strong and able to handle a lot that's been going on in Jesse Morton's world. And you know, you and I spent a lot of time, Jesse, working through this, and I know that it could be difficult to have this conversation, especially publicly, but to the extent that you'd like to share, because I think it's really important to recognize the parts and the process. And I appreciate it, but if you don't want to get into it, that's fine too.
Yeah,
well,
I mean,
if you don't want to talk about yourself, you could also talk about the parts you talk to with other people, you know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it would take quite a substantive time to dissect that. I don't know if we have enough, but one of the easiest ways for me to understand it is in being able to talk to the there's a former right-wing extremist that I love the way he does this, and he'll do it whether it's in public or in private. He'll talk to his child. He'll talk to little Tony, Tony McAleer, who helped found Little Hate, Life After Hate. There's a child in me that grew up. There's a part of me that grew up really fast and really early and developed this like wisdom at a very young age to dissect things that are very complicated and to try to understand why what was happening to me was happening to me. And that was a coping mechanism that ultimately became the part that I guess you could say drove Yunus Abdullah Muhammad to replace Jesse Morton. But there was the other part of growing up too fast, too soon and being traumatized that was my internal like baby me. And that child only ever just wanted to be told that he was loved and told that he was important and shown compassion. And unfortunately, I have to honestly say, other than my grandmother in my life, my two grandmothers, my grandfather too, some people, I never experienced an ounce of compassion. And so the two parts that are primarily important, I think, in dissecting the extremist mindset, extremists are not typically stupid people. They really are people that are torn between a very childish way of thinking about the world and a very adult way of thinking about the world that is marred by the sort of cognitive biases that the traumatized state they process information through and the competition between those two parts of themselves. It creates an inability to overcome the black and white rationalism that has cemented in the mind and in the psychology. And other parts I think are certainly apparent, but I think that those are the two competing. There's a lot of childishness in the underlying persona of extremists, both though knowing myself better now, and also looking at the people that I work with currently. And unfortunately, there is like a way that cocktail, if you will, intersects with each other to create a perfect stew for like the narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathology that sort of underlies this dark triad that I find competing or becoming predominant as the persona of grandiosity that is inside of us all, but through violent extremists is essentially predominating a belief that violence is the only way to tear down a society that has been very cruel to us outside of ourselves, so that we don't have to look at the inside of all those parts. And so, but yeah, it would take so long to go through that. It's like it's something that would take at least an hour to talk about more complicated components of that sort of internal family system, but also other understandings of trauma and parts related to it.
It's good, Jesse. It's good. And I think it was a good explanation. And thank you, Alex, for that question. We try to honor starting on time and ending on time. So there's just 3 minutes left. And I want to say a few things. First of all, I hope little Jesse Morton sees all these people, 200 of them, many who have written compliments in the comments, and are really thankful to you, Jesse, for changing yourself, rising above it all, finding people that you can attach to that are good to you and encourage you on your way to growth, and that you feel pounds of compassion, not ounces, that you didn't have in your childhood. And it's really great that you're reaching out to other people. I think it's wonderful that you understand to get somebody right away at that point of humiliation and shame and connect with them, offer a real attachment, and all the different ways. I mean, you're obviously very brilliant and you're using your mind in a wonderful way now. So I'd really like to congratulate you, and I hope you leave all the shame in the past and find a good community. And I think many of us would love to stay in contact with you and wish you all the best in your life and in your 2 networks that you're building. A lot of people are clapping for you. And
Oh, thank you.
yeah, so thanks for
Thank
talking to us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I will put my email address in the chat box. It's parallelnetworks@pnetworks.org, or you can contact me on our 24/7 helpline, which is 202-486-8633, which also functions as my cell phone. So, thank you guys. Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun, and these conversations could certainly go on for hours and hours, but it was good. Thank you. Just great series of questions, and you did fascinating work as well.
It was good, and you are good. You are good.
Thank you. Hope to keep in contact with you all. Thank you so much for your support and for listening and giving us your time. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you to everybody for participating. So we'll end the meeting, and thank you for Ari for honoring us with your presence. And
thank you, Dr. Kagansi.
Yeah. Bye-bye.